back. So,
So-
we left off with you taking a lot of photos throughout your career of different cars, personalities throughout history, racing history. Louder.
Yeah, you're Joe Rodriguez, not Joe Biden.
Yeah. I wouldn't even be able to speak if it was that.
Talk about the photos.
Yeah. All right, so you're okay.
There's a
stop,
fly
he
coming
stop,
at your
he
head.
stop, he's, okay.
You missed them.
And
Alright.
go.
All right, and go. So your the photos that you've taken over the course of your career, are there racing personalities, different cars and events?
Well, my photo interest was mechanical, basically. Most nowadays, you look at all these old books and everything that writes, it's generally the cars that they click, 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 click on. And I was interested in what's under the bodywork, all the suspensions and motors and all that. And there's that fly.
Yeah, there he is.
I think it was a BMW.
I saw a roundel on his.
And so I don't have that many photos in my memory of people involved, but they are there. And if you're going to get into it, you'll have a lot of pictures to look at.
And that is an entirely separate project.
Separate project.
So,
And I'm told now, you tell me that there are ways of taking negatives and looking at them, and they give you a positive photo to look at.
Yep.
What's the time gap? In other words, black and white negatives used to be on a strip. Can you just take that and go down through and see them all?
yeah.
And say, ooh, that one we want to look at?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Amazing technologies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's incredible. So we'll get into all the photos separately. That'll be a whole separate project basically. So we were talking about the time period. The time period in your career is where we left off was the March cars. So after that those programs were done, we're probably looking at the mid 80s, I guess, somewhere in there about.
Well, 83 is when I dropped out of taking care of the cars for Kemper and David.
Mm-hmm.
Family problems with health, my mother and my dad, and me, and running two cars there for a while, then two marches at the same time. It was a little bit overpowering, and I developed some problems that weren't serious, but the little yellow flags of life that wave, hey, check out this, check out that.
Your check
So I
engine
needed
light.
time off.
Yeah.
And obviously they gave me the time off. The program went to the Brits. Kemper and David had, in March, sent over two of their people. They got rid of two of their people, I could say, because they were nothing but problems on this end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it stood. I got away from cars for a while.
Backing up just a hair, 1981, you won the IMSA mechanics.
Mechanics of the Year.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that was a function of the very successful year we had with the M1, and the fact that it was the first time in, I think, IMSA's history that the driver points fund, the top and the next, were in the same car. So you had two drivers, top level and level, in a one car, and that's how I got Mechanic of the Year.
Mm-hmm. So, are there any drivers or personalities that stick out in your mind? People that, whether it be, someone that you worked with that left an impression, someone, story that, I know that there's a million, but if there's one that sticks out in your mind.
it's kind of hard because as a mechanic, you're focused on your crew. Obviously, people like John Paul Jr., he was young, and his father had the pushing. So he was always somebody that was young to watch and wow, look at him go and try this and try that. Al Holbert was good, obviously, and my career started basically with Bob Holbert. I took his car to California in 1961. That was a long time ago.
It was a while ago.
Yeah, the progress of life. Yeah, I respect a lot of drivers. Never had any problems with one that would say we shouldn't be racing with him. There are amateur racers that we know in the vintage game that they shouldn't be allowed on the track first place.
Well, it seemed like you worked with a lot of drivers when you were doing the vintage series with BMW, like Brian Redman, David Hobbs, Sam Posey, Hans Stuck, those guys, that crowd.
All good.
All good. Great guys, very down-to-earth guys. What can you tell me about those guys, that group of drivers? That, your experiences that you had with them.
Well, let's see. The one comment I heard from Sam Posey was up at Lime Rock. Somebody was talking with him, and we're in a group, and he did comment to Sam, don't you worry about getting in a car that you haven't driven for a while, concerns about maintenance and all that. And Sam gave me a nice big smile. Says, "No, if Jack did the car, I know it's all right." And that's a concern I've always had, that you have to have that camaraderie with a driver. In the past, they didn't, the drivers really didn't appreciate it because it was a blood sport. And back in the early days of sports car racing and Formula One, they all accepted that in the back of their mind, they might not come home.
Yeah.
So it was hard for them to make friends. Yeah. And if you have a guy that's working on 10 different cars, you don't want to have, well, I work on his car better than on your car. You don't want to build that kind of atmosphere.
Of course.
To me, a driver's comfort in the car has to go far beyond just physical comfort. And when he looks up at you prior to the green, yes, and asks, is this car ready to go? He's not asking, is it have 800 horsepower?
Right. He wants to know if it's safe. He wants to know if you did a good job. Yep, absolutely.
As the Brits say, safety first.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And nowadays I say, accessibility first, cosmetic second.
Cosmetics, yes.
I'm not going to spend time polishing wheels if we need to put the motor in.
Very true. So, moving into the next phase of what you got involved in after racing was restoring a lot of these vintage cars that you worked on for so many years. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the vintage drivers, that's a whole new group of drivers. And if they are the car owner and the driver, you have to try to understand what their mode of life is with the car. If they think they're going to get in the car and prove that they're better than Juan Fangio, who drove it 20 years ago, that's a problem. If they get in and start complaining about they're not going fast enough because, gee, I must have the wrong cam, or my tires are on their third heat cycle, they are the problem.
Right.
I like to go back to that old comment from Derek Bell, drive what you got and enjoy what you got, be part of the scene. You're here to be part of what a promoter is putting on to provide you the track to have fun in.
Mhm.
They're not here for your benefit.
Right, right.
And there is an ego problem with a lot of drivers. They think they're the best.
Of course.
And it's always the car's problem, which blows back at the mechanic.
Well, you the next phase of your career, you started to get again cars that you had worked on previously, like some of the Can-Am cars. Glenn Motorin, help me out, Vic
Well,
Francis.
When you're out of the daily and the monthly series of events, you tend to drop back into the shadows pretty easily.
Mhm.
Many of the amateur vintage racers aren't really looking for somebody to take care of their car 100% type thing, arrive and drive amateurs.
Right.
They want to go there because they want to be part of the scene. So playing with the vintage car people is a little bit different, and trying to convince them that they have the best car, or the best I can do, or the best. If they can finish the race, I'm happy. To me, finishing a checker flag, I'm content.
Right.
The engine ran well, the car ran well, they didn't crash it, nobody's hurt, we're having a nice dinner afterward. And the camaraderie is hard to fight, because they all have egos, and they'll all be concerned about the other guy that's always in my way. Well, if you're that fast, you can get around them, so get around them.
Right.
It's all up to the driver's egos, and it's hard to tell them, where did we bump into that at Elkhart after Ostrom got the M8B, and at one of those events later, they were all excited about getting pole position, and it somehow didn't feel comfortable with me, and I asked one of the local track people that's been there forever, have you repaved? Have you changed the course in any way? And he said, well, no, the curves are all the same. We did do some paving here and there. And I said, okay. So I looked into my records, and Bruce McLaren's time with the car Oscar was driving was 4 seconds faster than today's pole time.
Wow.
So, who's kidding who?
Wow.
Drive the car.
Yeah.
On old tires, Can-Am tires were made for hard, and his time at the track, the same track, was 4 seconds faster.
Wow.
So I don't get impressed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, we talk about, how times were very different back then between, there are tracks that, like for instance, Bridgehampton or Vineland, New Jersey, that are no longer around anymore. Do you have a favorite track that you?
Well, my favorite track is one that's easy to get to, and that's Watkins Glen in Pocono. I'm no longer concerned about a spectator end of watching races. If I don't know anybody in the group, even today's IMSA, you don't know anybody, and it's exciting to watch them, but I'm not a race fan, you might say.
Well, more from back then. So
Yeah.
when you would go and you were active in racing, doing the circuits, if you had a favorite track.
Again, it's favorite because of the facilities, the workability of the track. Lime Rock was always a swamp before they paved it, and you hated to go there because of my end of the game. You're doing in a muddy field. And as far as tracks go and performance by drivers on the track, some interviewer asked Mark Donohue one time, what's your favorite track? And he says, well, I don't have a favorite track. And he kind of looked at it, well, why not? Because if you have a favorite track, then you have an unfavorite track, and you'll never do well there.
Yeah. That's very true too.
It'll always be in the back of your mind, and I hate this place, you know.
Well, is there out of all the race cars that you've worked on so many different race cars, what was the best car to work on as far as just overall?
Well, again, the best car to work on of high caliber race cars of the day, I have to say, was the Bruce McLaren Mark 8B.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of the things on it that I noticed and commented to the crew about, and they say, well, Jack, you have to massage a car like a U-joint, a yoke U-joint. It's always a hell of a time to get the press fit of those into, and he says, you know, they don't break, they'll break in the cross, but not up in the yokes usually. And you know you're going to change it every race.
Mm-hmm.
So they would take those 2 holes on every yoke and hone them out with
Mm-hmm.
a brake hone, just so that you could slide that in.
Right.
When I got that car back, that guy right there,
Yep.
myself in the garage in Einan, I could, in 4 hours, I would have the engine out, engine ready to go back to McLaren for rebuild, the transmission out, all apart for Magnify, in 4 hours by myself.
Wow.
That's massaging a race car for workage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you appreciate it a hell of a lot more. The March, I have to say they were running back late. The March 82G, when I went over to England to see the car, the uprights were still on a milling machine. He's waiting for the shocks to come in from Holland where Coney was, and this was a Tuesday before the 24 hour.
Oh my God. Wow.
I flew back home, we packed up, and I drove down to the track, dropped off the tools and all, continued on to Miami to pick up the car that was flown in from England on Friday morning or Thursday, whatever it was, finished, ready to go.
Wow.
So they worked like hell to get that car together.
Sure.
So we ran Daytona. It had an engine problem with the dampers that always went away. BMW told us that their life expectancy was about 13 hours. So you don't go to a 24-hour race with something you know is going to break in 13 hours.
Right.
And the March had built a removable panel in the Venturi, so you could reach up there maybe and have to change that dampener. And of course the hole was far too low. You couldn't even get it would be 100% braille fitting if you could find the bolt, get it off. How do you get that never worked.
The Brits.
The Brits did it again. But when I got the car home from them, it took Al Morgan, my mechanic, 4 hours to get the body off. Because everything was 1032 with a nut and a bolt in the back of it,
Right.
instead of captive nuts being on.
So I think it's pretty safe to say that, you know, the other cars that you did work on ultimately became user friendly because
Easier, yeah.
You made them.
You gotta make it easier friendly,
you made them.
mechanic friendly.
Exactly.
If something's in your way once, can I move it over? Can I make a bracket? Can I drill a hole for access? I can show you a couple of special wrenches I had to make.
Oh yeah, and that's a whole other series we're gonna do.
And when I put that 320i transmission into the CSL,
Yep.
it's a bulkier, bigger, heavier gear thing.
Mm-hmm.
And on our bell housing, which was putting the engine on an angle, on well, I guess no, it was standing it up. Okay, standing it up now, vertical motor. The one bolt moved up into the tunnel work.
Right, okay.
And that upper right hand, he was a bitch to move
You couldn't get,
because the bigger transmission built its way out around the bolt.
right, yeah,
So the bolt holding the tranny to the bell housing had a head down in there, but it was surrounded by transmission. So you could see the end of it, but you couldn't get a socket on it.
right.
And I had to make a wrench that would go up between the tranny and the bell housing on the floorboard and turn it little at a time to get it out to change a tranny.
And that's not an uncommon thing that you ran into. You made many tools in order to do jobs just like that, correct?
Yeah, and then of course the next race, the bell or the floorboard had a panel there where I could take it off, and there you are. If it's in your way once, you don't let it be in your way twice. No,
So-
we did things on the cars that amazed people, speed wise. I think I mentioned the front suspension on the M1.
Mhm.
How about the input shaft on the March?
Yeah,
They told you about that one.
yeah. Well, it kind of goes into tech inspection. Tell me some of the experiences that you went through during tech inspection. Of course, you try and do things by the book, but you try and also modify things so, you know, you can also have somewhat of an advantage.
Well, talking with Jim Hall in the early days of our being able to talk to each other, we were talking about how to make a car handle. And Jim was a very basic guy. He knew how to talk to. He could talk a woman into how to go racing. You know? But he says the weight of the car obviously is important. And whatever the weight is, he says, picture yourself with a 10-pound weightlifting barbell. You grab the bar and do a 5-pound and a 5-pound and do that with it. Now pick up a 10-pound ball and you could spin it a lot easier. The inertia of moving those weights is highly critical on being able to snap a car in through the S's, where it's got to be going dancing back and forth. So try to move whatever way you have to play with in toward the center of gravity as best as possible. I actually looked at considering on the Camaro of the day, I was going to run a jack shaft off the front of the motor with the shaft coming back into the cockpit, being driven by the motor, so you can mount the alternator, the fuel pumps and all that low in the car,
Right.
back toward the CG. And that didn't go past tech too high. But I did have the battery. He opened the door, and Jack, the battery's in the driver's compartment,
Now that was in the Camaro, correct?
the Camaro.
Correct.
And I said, no, it isn't. It's in the door. The passenger compartment is the other side of the roll cage.
Right.
So he, well, okay.
Sarah?
Tell him about the stretched firewall in the Camaro.
I think I mentioned today.
We did. Yeah, we spoke about that actually.
The Trans Am had the rule about not moving the firewall.
Correct.
IMSA allowed you to move it back to the
Right.
windshield,
Right.
putting the bar in and
Yeah.
jacking it back. It was the ugliest firewall in the world.
The one that sticks out to me is there was a sticker on the back of the M1. Do you remember that one? Tell us about that one.
The Paul Miller and Kemper with the M1 first year we had it. And obviously in taking care of the car and all. I don't remember what prompted me to do that, but I painted on the back bumper with the little sticker, turbo, because that's what you do in a lot of cars. Well, we got protested like two other people. Oh, you're not allowed to have a turbo. I said, there's no turbo on the car. He says, yeah, tech inspector. I know, but some people don't have any common sense. Could you take it off? I peeled it off.
The other one was Roger, who was a tech inspector.
Roger Mansfield.
Yes.
Manderville, maybe?
His last
Dodson.
name. His last name escapes me. I forget.
Roger. Tech inspectors, they look at things, obviously.
Well, do you remember the little sign that you put under the car?
That's what I'm referring to.
Roger Bailey?
No, Roger, he was a tech inspector. One of the, like a Dodson type of driver. I think it might have been that. But he had made a Venturi under panel that went up to axle length, which was pushing the effort a little bit, technical wise, on aerodynamic additions. And knowing the tech inspectors would maybe questioning it, but way down low at the lowest ground point of the, looking at how far the tunnel would go in, was a little sign he put, "Hi, Roger." That was the tech inspector, Roger Bailey. He knew Roger to be down there looking. He knew he was pushing the rules a little bit.
So, moving forward into the next chapter, you maintained for some years the BMW Historical Collection. Is that correct? How did that come about? How did you get the BMW Historical Collection here? How did that relationship happen?
I think initially BMW of NA wasn't pushing racing that much.
Now, was that Eric Wensberg at the time? Was
Jim Patterson was involved in our CSL days, and he passed away with cancer. And Koch, Larry Koch picked up, and then Eric Wensberg picked up. But in those time periods, they realized that racing was becoming more and more active and noticeable. I don't know what the percentage of BMW sales is, but there are a lot of people that buy BMWs, or doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs that couldn't care less. They worried about their exposure at the golf club.
Mm-hmm.
So they were wondering about getting their old race cars runnable again for a 20th anniversary of BMW Motorsports that was coming up. And they checked around at various garages, and Eric at the time says, Jack knows all these cars. Can I handle it? So for that 20th anniversary, I had 9 of the NA cars here. The garage was full of BMW cars. And we did get them all running. The 320i motor had to be sent back to McLaren for their rebuild.
No, that was the David Hobbs car, correct?
The David Hobbs 320i.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Their M1, I recall trying to get that to turn over, but the engine seemed to be seized. And it was right before Sebring, going down as a spectator to see the Sebring race and talk to what's happening with Red Lobster, I think, again. But for whatever reason, I said, I'm going to fill the motor up with kerosene right up to the top, so it gets into all the bearings and all of that. And I came home, and it still wouldn't budge an inch. You couldn't take that flywheel and budge it one tooth.
Wow.
So I said, well, I guess we got to get the motor out. Got it out, pulled the pan, and the pan looked like it was full of a lime jello, lime and lemon jello.
Wow.
I said, what the hell is all this? And I called up Castrol, and I said, on your Castrol R oil, what's the drain period? He said, well, Castrol R is a vegetable-based oil. And he said, it will literally eat magnesium. It won't bother aluminum, it won't bother steel, but your magnesium oil pan, it loved smorgasbord.
Wow.
He says, with Castrol R, the way you handle it is after a race is over that weekend, while the motor is still hot, drain it all out. Don't let it set.
Right.
I said, well, this has been setting about 6 years or so. And he laughed.
Oh.
So not only did the gel go in, and it's in a photo on my desk over there,
Yeah.
but the piston rings see so little lubrication ever on any motor, but their tension is constantly pushing out against the wall.
Right.
So eventually whatever oil is in that area goes away, in comes condensation, the walls get literally attached, the rings get attached with rust to the walls. When I sent that motor up to up to Marcus Glarner, he says, Jack, I literally had to break the pistons with a chisel and hammer
Oh my
to get them loose from the walls,
God.
to get the rings off. He says that was the only way I could get that crank out. That's why it wouldn't move an inch.
Wow.
The pistons were seized to the block.
That's crazy.
Are you losing your voice?
I'm losing my mic.
He's playing with his.
There you go.
I see it,
There you
the
go.
green is there. It's blinking
Yeah,
downward.
and my high-tech clip here.
They should be flipped around.
These
You
are
don't
actually-
have to see the green light.
These are actually pretty good. They could be like leaning right up against you, and they still work pretty
Okay.
damn good.
Yeah, so magnesium and castor oil on the CSL, taking care of it over the years. And again, Kemper didn't use it much. Kevin Ladd didn't use it. And to get it running the first time after he had it laying quite a while,
Right.
I'm looking around at it. I'm underneath. And where the lower water pipe comes out of the radiator and goes into the water pump,
Mhm.
I see the fuzz around
The mag.
the hose.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, I wonder if it's a little leak causing a fuzz. I grabbed it, gave it a shake, and it broke off the water pump. The entire lower hose
Wow.
and the water pump magnesium fitting that goes into it broke off. The water pump was seized, the whole bit, all because of magnesium in the total search for less weight. Rather than aluminum, they went to magnesium. And then in racing, you're not allowed to use antifreezes and things that stop corrosion.
Right.
So again, there was a nice delivery of magnesium to the organic world.
So speaking of that, so on these BMW race cars, they did use a lot of magnesium. The wheel centers on the BBS wheels,
Yeah.
the cylinder heads on an M49, the water pumps. How hard or easy was it to get parts, if any?
Well, I don't think the heads are made of aluminum, I think.
Were they? Because
I
I
think
didn't know
so.
whether they were made of mag or aluminum.
Unless they were possibly
right. No, they
being
could
built
have been.
for
You're right, they weren't. Sorry.
yeah,
All the
yeah.
BMW purists are just sending hate mail to me right now. Yes, it's all coming in now. So it was like the water pump, the wheels.
Water pumps were magnesium,
Right.
and they all rotted.
Yeah.
And Henry Schmidt out at BMW of San Francisco, in his car, he said enough's enough. So he had a nice new pump, and he gave it to somebody who reverse engineered, made molds,
Mm-hmm.
and cast up 10 in aluminum.
Right.
And we bought one of those, and it's been on the car ever since.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's the search for less weight. It's important, yes, but the important factor that most teams look at, they want to build the car as light as possible so that they can add weight to bring it up to minimum weight, but adding weight for proper distribution of the weight.
Right, right.
So in most cases, if they simply raise the weight limit and commented about these are for safety items, how much can you save in weight between magnesium and aluminum?
Well,
We have the aluminum flywheel from the CSL,
oh, okay.
and I have it hanging in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcus, who is a very deep history guy, is on the CSLs. He looked at it, and you could see his eyes open up. Jack, where did you get this? I said, where did I get what? He said, it's the flywheel off of our M1, or our CSL. He said, the teeth are aluminum. They actually made, for the 7.5-inch 3-plate clutch, they machined the entire flywheel out of aluminum with the starter teeth in it,
Wow.
because the further out from center you get the weight is where inertia means.
Right,
So if you have to make the flywheel with that big steel ring,
right.
it's adding more weight to the flywheel, and they can't make their shifts fast enough. And I said, to me, that's bullshit.
Yeah,
You gotta finish these long races.
right.
And all it took Kemper once or twice with the air, is the car running, you go to start it, and sometimes it was starting and it hit the button again, and the starter would come out and knock the teeth off the flywheel. And back then it was another $1,500 for a flywheel. But they did have a steel face for the clutch.
Right, right.
But that's, I think, an insane search for less weight in a race car.
Did you, so when you built the car, did you, you wanted to use things that were more readily available then? Something that wasn't as, where you had to send back to England to go to get one, or off the shelf,
Yeah.
or?
Accessibility and acceptability is quick, it's hard. Dealing with Munich on spare parts, I don't know speak Deutsch. So how do I communicate that what do I want? They make this nice, Revell makes this nice big scale model of the CSL.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that their instruction manual for assembling this was very highly detailed in photos.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a point where I would actually make a copy of one of those pages and point, I need this part. and then you'd have to have it shipped in from Europe to Wilkes-Barre, go down to customs, finally get the box, bring it home, open it up, and say, the wrong part.
Wrong part.
Put it back in.
Or
ship
it was a
back.
small plastic part from the model. No, the real car, the 1-to-1 scale.
Yeah, they were the fun games of racing.
Yeah.
But you have to make your part yourself sometime, and so we stayed with the steel flywheel.
So I'm trying to think of the next thing.
The next dramas of motor racing. Let's say what could have happened that's of interest. The CSL has several of them. We talk again about weight and about finishing. They had a 32-gallon tank in them for I think it was 120 liter.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter Gregg had an auxiliary tank back there. And he says, no, what is that for? Isn't that carrying more? He said, well, we had to stuff the box to make sure we weren't carrying too much. But the pickup of the tank was a little bucket on the bottom. And how do you know when you're running out of gas? So he used that pickup tank to fill this other tank. And on that, he had a moderating level. So he knew that when he was out of gas with the big tank, he had this to get home on,
Mm-hmm.
get back to the pits. And they worried about the added weight. The generator being mounted, being driven by a belt off the half shaft. Back then they weren't making super magnified alternators that didn't like high RPM. So when you have it on the engine, no matter what kind of pulley size you played with, you were always taking the alternator and through the gears. So they mounted it back on the transaxle, being driven by one of the half shafts. And obviously you had no power going back into the battery until you got rolling and turning the alternator fast enough. So, but that gave them the life of an alternator for a 24-hour race.
Right.
And we bumped into that on the McLarens as well in vintage days, where the battery would go dead eventually, and the jumper cables and all that. You can't see it, but right below my left knee, there was a socket on the side where you'd plug in your jumper battery.
Right.
So I went and mounted one on the axle.
Those cars were very simple, where they were, you know, you always say they were basically like one wire and, you know.
Well, with today's electronic world, I've often commented that the Can-Am cars, 200-mile-an-hour cars, they wouldn't run them on some of the tracks in later years because they were outspeeding the cars of the day. But the speed differential, what were we discussing a minute? The cars, when they first came out, Jim Hall was the master and innovator. You could change things from one race to another. And one of the times he was sitting there looking at the McLaren with the bodywork off and just looking, "What you see there, Jim?" He says, "Nothing." He says, "These are very unremarkable cars being driven remarkably well." He says, "You know, we're always looking for that little trick that somebody might have that, I'll bet that works up faster." He was great for our racing game.
Wow.
I commented one time and said, "How about having retro rockets on each corner so that right at the apex of a corner, it would automatically and he didn't say no immediately. He thought about it. No, we'd have to carry too much fuel for them. Well, testing at Rattlesnake Raceway, keeping your oil cool in the open chaparral, open cockpit. And he noticed a lot of smoke, or he thought the firewall being flat there would be a good spot to put the oil cooler. Figured getting that air blast. So he says, "I mounted one there," and I went out and did a couple laps, and I'm looking over, and I could see smoke coming out of the engine compartment, through the cooler, up over the engine. I said, the pressure, air pressure being squeezed under the flat bottom chaparral, when it got to the engine bay, went pressurizing the engine and blowing air out that way.
Right.
And one of those little instances is what got his aerodynamic mind going. The airflow.
Well, it reminds me of the photos that you took of was the March car, where you were in an area where there was
Atlanta.
a lot of clay, a lot of red clay.
Atlanta.
Green, and you could see the marks of the red clay coming out, and where you would think of how that air would go, it was not that way.
Air does a funny thing.
Right.
It was on Holbert's Porsche.
Tell me about that.
And it was rainy in practice days or whatever. And the mud at Atlanta was really red clay.
Right.
It would stain up all the cars. And in one of the sessions, or I don't know if it was the race itself, but the car had a lot of red clay airflow photos on it. And their intercoolers were in the front of the cockpit area, or the engine area, and they had a nice scoops going up the back of the front fenders to feed air to the coolers. And you could see the flow lines of the red clay coming down into the fender hole and then reversing and going out over the top. There was enough back pressure of the intercoolers to stop the airflow from just blasting through.
Right. Yeah.
So they would play with little elements that they put out on the duct to make sure it was going in further.
Were you telling me about cars that they had used at Langley for air in their wind tunnel testing facility? Was it the March car that they did that with, or do you?
Their first attempts at aerodynamics with March on building the 82, they had it over at the wind tunnel in France.
Okay.
And they say that it was the first time they had a car that was so aerodynamically clean. Tom Fabi, Ted Fabi, former driver
Teo Fabi?
No, the
and driver.
Oh, Teo Fabi.
Tim Fabi. He drove it at a test session in Monterey, and of course we flew out. Kemper and I flew out, and they were all interested. What do you think? Can you feel any downforce? And of course, he's not going to say no. But he said, oh yeah, I can feel the downforce. They definitely want to feel like sticking better in the corners. Problem was with the 82, they had a belly pad built on it that was right down at 2 inches ground clearance.
Right.
And just driving out of the pit sometime, you'd be scraping it and worrying about it. So they didn't last too long. And everybody that had the cars was throwing them away to go back up to sitting at the bottom of the tub. And then to get the driver's space for your tush and your helmet,
Right.
they had steps cut in the floor pad so the driver could sit down on the floor. And that just killed all the aero coming through. So they never really had good downforce on the Marches because of the aerodynamics underneath.
It really was the infancy of the beginning stages of.
And again, the mud flow, the photos I have of the exit air coming out of the Venturis, you can see a flow pattern and then the burbling and going away where it lost all the suck.
Right.
The same as the stall angle of a wing. An airplane's wing will go up until it finds that the air is burbling and they lose the lift and the plane just drops.
Right.
So that's the lift of your spoiler.
So these cars were, the Can-Am cars. Going back to the Can-Am cars, they were. You said that they were a handful to drive. When Oscar drove the car, what was his feedback to you? How did you, when you were working with him to set the car up, did he, what was his feedback with the car as far as power goes and as far as handling? I know that there was a throttle. He was curious to know if he had full throttle or not. Do you remember that?
Oh, well, after getting out of the Mark VI McLaren with a small block in it, and then jumping into this trophy-winning top of the line.
Right, big block, yeah.
We were at Pocono, and we took it up for a test run and drove it around. And I said, Oscar, the time frame, I never checked to see if you're getting full throttle from the gas pedal to there. And he looked at me and he said, my God, I hope we are. He said, holy, no wonder I couldn't beat these cars. Yeah, the big blocks obviously had a lot more power.
Oh, yeah.
Oscar was a good driver.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. He was good.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of bad habits.
Yeah, but you work well together. You know, you and Oscar work very well together.
Yeah.
So it made it was a good match. You know. So being that this is an informal interview, so
I think we're doing a good job with your question.
I think
You
so.
got me thoroughly confused.
Yeah.
I don't know what year I'm in.
Well, we're jumping around a little bit, but we're kind of in that.
That's good.
We're in that period, 90s up to that area. So
You were talking about Oscar and the M8B. Did you tell him about Oscar's comments about the differences between the M6 in handling, between the M6 and the M8?
I don't know if you picked that up in sound.
oh yeah,
Just say it again. What is it? What's the question?
The difference in handling between the M6B McLaren and the M8B. Oscar's saying you could slide the M6. You couldn't do that with the M8.
The M6 was a small block that didn't have the immediate big torque factor, of course. The tires of the day were getting away from treaded tires into slicks. The Goodyear tires of the day had high sidewalls on a 15-inch wheel. The trailing arms, the upper trailing arms for the rear suspension were about an inch and a half along the sidewall of the tire, and there'd be rubber marks on that bar from the tires moving that far and rubbing, to a point where I was going to put a roller on it so that it could roll rather than rub against the suspension link. I didn't want to move the links in. I said we could make spacers on the wheels and get them out further, but then you get into the fender problems. And we never had a big race shop to try all that or test with all that.
right.
And with that degree of power and tire slippage and moving around, Oscar used to also drive Senator T. Newell Wood from Pennsylvania, had a Lotus 23. And he would drive that in SCCA and jump into his Ferrari or into the McLaren or whatever. And he commented that the Mark 6 is kind of like that old Lotus. He said, you could throw that around and force yourself into a power drift with power. He said, you don't want to try that with the Mark 8. He said, it hung on, and snap, you're loose, spinning around.
And bite you.
It didn't give you much warning
Right.
of, I'm at my limit.
Not as forgiving. Yeah.
He says, but the Mark 6 was fun to drive because he says, I could play with the guy behind me thinking I'm losing it.
Right.
He would turn it sideways deliberately. The guy would hit the brakes and Oscar would scoot off. And he would do that. He says, can we put one of the tricks of the day for the real bad guys? He says, you know the brake switch, the pedal switch, power, when you step on the brakes, the hydraulic fluid closes and your brake lights come on. He says, put it over on the clutch line. So every time you hit the clutch, the brake lights would
come
flash.
on.
So we tried it once, and he says, no, Oscar, we don't want to get caught cheating like this.
Yeah.
Cheat-neat, isn't
Yeah.
that what, down there at Paleface Harbor, the guys next door, those, he says, you gotta
Smoky
learn how to
Munich.
cheat neat, the NASCAR boys.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was definitely a special time in racing. Definitely, like you said, the greatest time. No question.
The Smoky unit car complaining about too much fuel capacity. How come you're going further? Well, we're and while the tech boys are at the back with the fuel cell open and drying it out to fill it up to see what its volume was, while he was up front barking and moaning about the tech inspections and all that, got pissed off and said, I'm getting the hell out of here. Got in the car, started up, and drove off. That's when they realized, where the hell is he hiding gas? All the fuel, all the roll cage was a gas tank. How to cheat and eat.
Yeah.
Well, remember that program Ray Evernham did out down at Amelia a couple years ago? Racing Around the Rules is what they called it.
Yes.
And Ray laid out 3 separate tape measures. If the tech inspector was going, here, I got a tape measure here. 3 tape measures, all measuring something different.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, they pushed the word NASCAR production, stock cars. They're not stock. Especially today. It's all a kit car.
Oh yeah.
One guy's making all the body work, the other guy's making all the chassis.
It's what
I have a
kills.
friend that worked at Hendrix. I says, what is really stock? What could you call stock? He had a hell of a time thinking of something. Everything's modified to some degree.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's killed a lot of these series, with these rules. It started with midget cars, when midgets first started, you could build your car in a barn in Iowa somewhere and go and win races. And then after a while, they were all the same cars. They were all going around and around. And there was just a parade lap, and they
Well,
They
that's
stopped
what's
watching.
happened nowadays to racing. Did I just go through that story earlier
Yeah.
about a racetrack being wide, one lane back ride?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's happening today. How do you solve that problem? You got the fastest car in qualifying up front. Every corner worker is out of tips of his toes. The track is clean as a whistle. The Colin Chapman approach to Formula One back in Lotus days with Jimmy Clark. They were talking to him one time about how do you build and set up a car. And he says, most people, most engine and race car builders are fighting away for less weight. And he says, we build a car to run at half weight, half tank full of gas. Because now you're hitting the best and the worst of weight distribution. And our game plan is to have Jimmy Clark do your damnedest to be on the pole for qualifying. That's our race of the weekend, the qualifying. So once we got the pole, now Jimmy sits there with a full tank of gas and a clean track, and everybody's on their turn. He knows from the second that flag drops, he has an advantage on everybody, and try to set up such a lead that it demoralizes the rest of the group. And so weight has its advantages in a car. I don't know if it was Brian Redmond or one of the original, David Hobbs, said, the CSL always handled better with a full load of gas. So the added weight of all that gas balanced the car. To get a car doing a four-wheel drift uniformly, controllably, without power or fighting with the steering, to have all four sliding under your control.
I could see that. It's light in the ESN, that's why.
But today's rubber, in tires, they don't allow that kind of stuff anymore.
Well, you got 15 inches of rubber on each tire on the ground on those things.
That's what always amazes me today. Tomorrow we'll be watching the Formula One race of today's cars, and with all the camera work they now have, take notice to the wear pattern on the front tires. So if that's your tread of the tire from there to there, how come all of this is nice fresh rubber and you can see a path?
Right.
There's that much camber in those tires.
Yeah.
So they're not using all that rubber as going straight. So obviously with the G loads of the turns, they're moving down and using the whole tread. And that's why you see in all the turns the little rolls of
Rolls of
rubber.
rubber, yeah.
They're coming off the tire, literally getting rolled off the tire.
Right.
That kind of traction.
Yeah.
Must be great.
The limits.
We never had that in Can-Am days.
The limits of adhesion, as
The
Jackie
limits of
Stewart would,
adhesion, yes.
would call it.
I think we're at an hour.
Okay,
I think we're good for now. Okay.
I'm
Well,
good.
You've got plenty to edit.
We're not, actually, we're not